The city was dying, and no one wanted to admit it. Jerusalem, once filled with songs of worship and the confidence of divine protection, now lived under a suffocating tension as the armies of Babylon tightened their grip around its walls. Fear moved through the streets like a quiet plague. Food was scarce, hope was thinner, and truth had become something dangerous, something people avoided, silenced, and eventually tried to bury. Because truth had a voice, and that voice belonged to Jeremiah, the man who refused to soften the message no one wanted to hear. He did not speak of victory or miraculous deliverance. He spoke of surrender, of judgment, of a coming fall that could no longer be avoided. And in a city desperate for comfort, his words felt like betrayal. What kind of nation hears a warning meant to save it, and responds by destroying the messenger? That question hung invisibly over Jerusalem as its leaders made a choice that would reveal the true condition of their hearts. The officials who surrounded the throne of Zedekiah were not ignorant men. They understood the situation. They saw the enemy, and they heard Jeremiah's words clearly. But clarity did not produce courage. Instead, it produced resentment. They approached the king with a carefully crafted accusation, claiming that Jeremiah was weakening the soldiers and discouraging the people, as if truth itself were the enemy. Beneath their words was a deeper fear, the fear that if the people believed Jeremiah, they would lose control. And power, once threatened, rarely responds with humility. It responds with suppression. Zedekiah listened, and in that moment, history balanced on the edge of his decision. He knew Jeremiah had spoken truth before. He had privately sought the prophet's counsel, quietly acknowledging what he would never publicly defend. Yet when the moment came to act, to stand against injustice, to protect the one voice that still spoke clearly, the king chose the most destructive form of leadership, not open rebellion against truth, but passive surrender to those who opposed it. He did not issue a direct command to kill Jeremiah. He did something far worse. He said, "He is in your hands," and with those words he stepped back, allowing injustice to move forward unchecked. When power refuses to defend what is right, it silently authorizes what is wrong, and the consequences are always deeper than expected. They took Jeremiah not to a place of trial or exile, but to a cistern, a deep, abandoned pit carved into the earth, once used to store water but now filled with thick, suffocating mud. It was the kind of place designed to be forgotten, hidden from sight, removed from concern. They lowered him down slowly with ropes, not with urgency but with intention, ensuring that he would not escape, ensuring that his end would come not by the violence of a sword but by the slow cruelty of neglect. At first, his feet found the bottom, but the ground beneath him was not solid. The mud shifted, swallowed, pulled, and with every movement he sank deeper. This was not an execution that would be witnessed and remembered. This was erasure. No bloodshed, no public outrage, just silence as a man of God disappeared beneath the surface of indifference. Imagine the darkness of that pit, the cold pressing in from every side, the weight of the mud gripping his body, pulling him down inch by inch. There were no voices, no light, no reassurance that anyone would come. Only the quiet realization that the people he had tried to save had chosen to abandon him. What happens to a nation when it buries the only voice that still speaks truth? That question was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time beneath the streets of Jerusalem. Above ground, life continued with a disturbing normalcy. Soldiers still guarded the walls, officials still discussed strategy, and the king still occupied his throne. But everything had changed in a way that could not be immediately seen, because the real collapse of Jerusalem was not happening at the gates where Babylon waited. It was happening within the hearts of its leaders. Pride had replaced repentance, fear had replaced faith, and silence had replaced courage. Zedekiah knew what was right, but he chose safety. The officials knew the consequences, but they chose control. The people sensed the truth, but they chose comfort. And so the city moved forward, unaware that it had already crossed a line from which there would be no return. When a society chooses to silence truth instead of confronting it, it does not protect itself, it accelerates its own destruction. Down in the pit, Jeremiah felt the physical reality of what the nation had become. The mud that clung to him, that pulled him deeper with every passing moment, was a reflection of the moral and spiritual condition above him. He had spoken for God, and now his voice was being swallowed by the very people who needed it most. Time lost its meaning in that darkness. There was no way to measure how long he had been there, no way to know if rescue would ever come. Each attempt to move only caused him to sink further, draining his strength, tightening the grip of the mire around him. Breathing became harder, not just because of the physical strain but because of the weight of abandonment. He was not just trapped in mud, he was trapped in the consequence of a nation's refusal to listen. And yet, even in that place, the story was not over, because while Jerusalem had chosen to forget him, heaven had not. There are moments in history when everything seems lost, when truth appears to have been completely silenced, when the forces of power and fear seem to have won. But those moments often become the turning points where unexpected courage emerges from the most unlikely places. The question was no longer whether Jeremiah would survive on his own. He could not. The question was whether anyone would be willing to risk everything to intervene. In a city filled with people who had reasons to stay silent, reasons to protect themselves, reasons to avoid conflict, the possibility of action seemed almost impossible. Rescuing Jeremiah would not be a simple act of kindness. It would be a direct challenge to the officials who had orchestrated his death. It would be a confrontation with a system that had already justified its decision. It would require stepping into danger without any guarantee of protection. And yet, history is rarely changed by those who wait for safety. It is changed by those who decide that something else matters more. The silence above the pit was not just the absence of sound, it was the presence of fear. The kind of fear that convinces people to do nothing even when they know something must be done. How many lives have been lost, not because no one cared, but because no one acted? That question echoed invisibly through Jerusalem as the prophet sank deeper into the mud, his strength fading, his body weakening, his voice nearly gone, and still, no one came. Not the priests who should have recognized the voice of God, not the soldiers who had sworn to protect their people, not the officials who claimed to lead, not even the king who had the authority to stop it all. Jeremiah had become inconvenient, and inconvenient people are often abandoned, even by those who know better. The city had made its choice, and that choice revealed something devastating. It was easier to silence truth than to confront it, easier to eliminate the messenger than to change direction, easier to pretend everything was under control than to admit that judgment was at the door. But just when it seemed that the story would end in silence, that the pit would become a grave and the prophet a forgotten memory, something began to shift beyond the awareness of the city's leaders. Because courage does not always come from where we expect it. Sometimes it rises from the margins, from those who are overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. Sometimes the one who acts is not the one with power, status, or influence, but the one who refuses to accept what everyone else has already justified. Somewhere within the structure of the royal court, beyond the circles of influence and authority, there was a man who saw what others ignored, who felt what others suppressed, who understood that what was happening was not just wrong, it was intolerable. He was not a prophet, not a priest, not a general. He was an outsider, a foreigner, someone who did not even belong to the people who claimed to follow God. And yet, in a moment when those who should have acted remained silent, he would become the one who moved. His name was Ebed-Melech, and while Jerusalem sank deeper into fear, he was about to rise in courage. The silence of the pit was not the end of the story. It was the moment before everything changed. In a city paralyzed by fear, where truth had been buried and courage had all but disappeared, the last person anyone expected to act was not a priest, not a soldier, not even a native son of Jerusalem, but a foreigner, a man whose very identity placed him on the margins of society. His name was Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian official serving within the court of Zedekiah, and while the entire system around him had quietly agreed to let a prophet die, something within him refused to stay silent. What makes a man risk everything when everyone else chooses safety? That question begins to take shape the moment Ebed-Melech hears what has been done to Jeremiah. The news was not hidden, not entirely. Whispers travel quickly in a city under pressure, but what people did with that knowledge revealed everything. Most heard and turned away. Some justified it. Others convinced themselves it was necessary. But Ebed-Melech did something radically different. He believed it was wrong, and that belief did not stay passive. It moved him. He understood the danger immediately. This was not a small injustice or a minor political decision. Jeremiah had been condemned by powerful officials, men who controlled access to the king, men whose authority could not be easily challenged without consequence. To oppose them was to step into a conflict that could cost him his position, his freedom, even his life. And yet, in a moment where calculation would have advised silence, Ebed-Melech chose conviction over caution, because there are moments when doing nothing becomes more dangerous than taking action, not physically, but morally, spiritually, eternally. What kind of man risks everything for someone who is not even his own people? That question cuts deeper when we realize that Ebed-Melech owed Jeremiah nothing. He was not bound by shared heritage, not obligated by tradition, not protected by status. He was an outsider in every sense of the word. And yet, it was precisely this distance that may have allowed him to see clearly what others had distorted. While those who claimed to belong to God's people justified injustice, the foreigner recognized it instantly. Without delay, he moved toward the one place where change could still happen, the King's Gate, specifically the Benjamin Gate, a place of decision, authority, and public visibility. This was not a quiet conversation in a hidden chamber. This was a bold, deliberate approach to power at a moment when power had already failed. Imagine the scene. The city tense under siege, guards alert, officials moving with urgency, and into this environment steps a man who should have kept his head down, who should have remained invisible, who should have known his place. But instead of shrinking back, Ebed-Melech steps forward. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear dictate your actions. As he approaches Zedekiah, he is not just carrying information, he is carrying a challenge, a confrontation wrapped in urgency. And the way he speaks reveals both his boldness and his clarity. He does not soften the truth. He does not navigate around it. He does not hide behind diplomacy. He says plainly that what has been done to Jeremiah is evil. That word of all cuts through every excuse, every justification, every political calculation. It reframes the situation entirely. This is not strategy. This is not governance. This is not necessary action in a time of war. This is wrong. And by naming it, Ebed-Melech forces the king to face what he has tried to avoid. How often do systems continue an injustice simply because no one is willing to name it for what it is? In that moment, Ebed-Melech becomes the voice that the entire city had lost. He speaks what Jeremiah had been speaking all along, but now he speaks it directly to the one man who still has the authority to change the outcome. There is a quiet but powerful tension here, because Zedekiah has already shown who he is, a man who knows the truth but fears the consequences of acting on it. And yet, something about this confrontation is different. Perhaps it is the clarity, perhaps it is the courage, or perhaps it is the undeniable reality that, if nothing is done, Jeremiah will die. Time is no longer a distant concern, it is immediate. Jeremiah is not in a prison where he can survive indefinitely. He is in a pit, sinking, weakening, approaching a point of no return. Every moment matters. Every delay increases the likelihood that rescue will come too late. Ebed-Melech understands this, and his urgency reflects it. He does not come with a suggestion. He comes with a demand for action, wrapped in the language of truth. And this is where the story begins to shift in a subtle but significant way. Because for the first time, Zedekiah responds differently. He does not deflect, he does not dismiss, he does not hand the situation back to the officials. Instead, he gives an order. He tells Ebed-Melech to take men with him and pull Jeremiah out of the cistern before he dies. It is not a full transformation of character. It is not a sudden rise of courage. But it is a crack in the pattern of silence, and sometimes that is enough to begin change. But even this moment raises another question. Why now? Why does the king act when he has refused before? Perhaps it is because courage is contagious. When one person steps forward, it disrupts the illusion that no action is possible. It exposes the reality that silence is a choice, not a necessity. Ebed-Melech's boldness creates space for the king to act, even if only partially, even if imperfectly, and this reveals something crucial. Systems of fear are often sustained not by absolute power, but by collective hesitation. Break that hesitation, and the system begins to weaken. Still, The danger has not disappeared. The officials who wanted Jeremiah dead are still in power. The city is still under siege. The outcome is still uncertain. And now Ebed-Melech must move from confrontation to action. He gathers 30 men, not a small group, not an insignificant effort. This is a coordinated rescue, one that requires planning, strength, and precision. Because pulling a man out of a muddy cistern is not simple. It is physically demanding and logistically complex. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the effort could fail. But what stands out is not just the scale of the operation, but the heart behind it. Ebed-Melech does not treat this as a task to be completed quickly or carelessly. He approaches it with intention, with awareness of Jeremiah's condition, with a level of compassion that transforms the rescue into something more than just an act of defiance. It becomes an act of mercy. Before they even reach the pit, he goes to a place beneath the treasury and gathers old rags and worn-out clothes, items that most people would consider useless, discarded, without value. And yet, in his hands, they become essential tools. Why rags? Because ropes alone would cut into Jeremiah's weakened body. Because a man who has been sinking in mud, who has not eaten, who has lost strength, cannot endure the harsh pull of coarse ropes against his skin. Ebed-Melech thinks beyond the immediate goal of rescue and considers the experience of the one being rescued. He anticipates the pain, and he acts to reduce it. This is what separates mere action from compassionate action. It is not enough to do the right thing. How we do it matters. As they reach the cistern and lower the ropes, Ebed-Melech calls down to Jeremiah, instructing him to place the rags under his arms before they begin to pull. Imagine that moment, the voice breaking through the darkness, the first sign that he has not been forgotten, the realization that someone has come. What does it feel like to hear hope when you have already begun to accept death? The rescue itself is slow, careful, deliberate. 30 men pulling together, lifting not just a body but a voice, not just a man but a message that refuses to be silenced. The mud resists, clings, tries to hold on, but it cannot withstand the combined force of determination and compassion. Inch by inch, Jeremiah rises, out of the darkness, out of the mire, back into the light. This is more than a physical extraction. It is a reversal of what the city had tried to do. They had attempted to bury truth. Ebed-Melech brings it back to the surface. They had chosen silence. He restores a voice. They had acted out of fear. He acts out of courage. And in doing so, he changes the trajectory of the story. What makes this moment so powerful is not just the outcome, but the identity of the one who made it possible. A foreigner, an outsider, a man with no obligation to intervene becomes the instrument through which God preserves his prophet. And this raises a question that echoes far beyond this ancient story. What if the people we least expect to act are the very ones who see most clearly what must be done? What if distance from power allows for clarity that proximity distorts? Ebed-Melech did not have the same pressures, the same alliances, the same fears that controlled the others. And because of that, he was free to choose differently. Free to act, free to stand for what was right when everyone else stood still. But the story is not over, because rescuing Jeremiah does not end the crisis. Jerusalem is still under judgment. The decisions that led to this moment still carry consequences that cannot be undone. And while one man has been saved from the pit, an entire city is still heading toward collapse. The question now is not just who will act, but what happens when a nation refuses to change even after being given another chance to hear the truth. Because sometimes, rescue is not enough to prevent judgment. Sometimes, it only ensures that the truth will still be heard when the consequences finally arrive. The rescue of Jeremiah did not begin at the edge of the pit, began in the mind of a man who understood that courage without wisdom can fail just as quickly as fear without action. Ebed-Melech had already done what no one else dared to do. He confronted power, he named injustice, and he secured permission from Zedekiah to act. But now came the part that would determine whether his courage would succeed or collapse under the weight of reality. Because pulling a man out of a muddy cistern is not just an act of strength, it is an act of precision, empathy, and foresight. What looks simple from a distance becomes dangerously complex up close, and Ebed-Melech understood something that many overlook in moments of urgency. How you save someone matters just as much as the decision to save them. Time was already working against them. Every moment Jeremiah remained in that pit, his body weakened further, his ability to hold on diminished, his chances of survival slipping away. The mud was not passive, it clung, resisted, pulled downward with a quiet, relentless force. A careless attempt to extract him could easily turn into a fatal mistake. If they rushed, the ropes could tear into his skin. If they pulled unevenly, his body could twist or slip. If they underestimated the depth or the resistance, they might fail entirely. This was not a situation that allowed for improvisation. It required intention. It required planning. It required something deeper than urgency. It required care. How often do people attempt to fix what is broken without considering the condition of what they are trying to save? That question becomes painfully real when the stakes involve a human life. Before even approaching the cistern, Ebed-Melech made a decision that would define the entire rescue. He went beneath the treasury, into a place where discarded items were kept: old rags, worn-out garments, pieces of cloth that had lost their original purpose and value. To most, these were useless, forgotten remnants of something that once mattered but no longer did. But in that moment, Ebed-Melech saw them differently. He saw potential. He saw protection. He saw a way to bridge the gap between strength and compassion. Because ropes alone would not be enough. Ropes could lift, but they could also wound. And Jeremiah, after days in the pit, would not be strong enough to endure that kind of strain. So Ebed-Melech gathered the rags, not as an afterthought, but as an essential part of the plan. What kind of rescuer thinks not only about getting someone out, but about minimizing the pain along the way? That question reveals the difference between efficiency and empathy. When they arrived at the cistern, the scene had not changed. The darkness remained. The silence remained. The mud still held its grip, but something else entered that space for the first time since Jeremiah had been abandoned. Attention. The presence of men at the edge of the pit signaled that what had been left to die was now being confronted. And then came the voice. Ebed-Melech called down, breaking through the silence that had surrounded Jeremiah for so long. It was not just a call to action. It was a declaration that he had not been forgotten. Imagine hearing that voice after believing no one would come, after feeling the weight of abandonment settle into your bones. Hope does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in a single instruction, a single moment where someone reaches into your darkness and says, "We are here." But even in that moment, Ebed-Melech does not rush. He does not simply lower the ropes and command the men to pull. He gives specific instructions, carefully thought out, deeply considerate. He tells Jeremiah to place the rags and worn-out clothes under his arms, between his skin and the ropes. This detail might seem small, almost insignificant compared to the larger act of rescue, but it is precisely this detail that transforms the moment, because it acknowledges Jeremiah's condition. It recognizes his weakness, it anticipates his pain, and it responds to it with compassion. This is not just about lifting a man out of a pit. It is about preserving his dignity, his body, his ability to endure the process. How many acts of help fail because they ignore the reality of the one being helped? How often do people impose solutions without considering the cost to the one receiving them? Ebed-Melech refuses to make that mistake. The ropes are lowered, the rags are positioned, and then the pulling begins. 30 men working together, not in chaos, not in haste, but in coordinated effort. Each movement matters. Each step must be steady. The weight is not just physical, it is symbolic. They are lifting a man the city tried to bury, a voice the system tried to silence, a truth that refused to disappear even when pushed into the darkest place imaginable. The mud resists, clinging as if it has a claim, as if it has already decided the outcome. But resistance does not determine the final result. Persistence does. Inch by inch, Jeremiah begins to rise. It is slow, it is difficult, it requires constant adjustment, constant awareness, but it is working, and with every inch gained, the narrative shifts further away from death and closer to life. What makes this moment so powerful is not just that Jeremiah is being rescued, but how he is being rescued. There is no violence here, no dramatic confrontation with the officials who condemned him, no sudden reversal of power. Instead, there is something quieter, something more profound, a deliberate act of mercy carried out with precision and care. This is what could be called decisive mercy. It is not passive. It is not hesitant. It acts boldly, but it acts wisely. It understands that urgency does not eliminate the need for compassion. In fact, it increases it, because when someone is at their weakest, the way they are treated in that moment leaves a lasting impact. And Ebed-Melech ensures that Jeremiah's rescue is not just effective, but humane. As Jeremiah emerges from the pit, covered in mud, exhausted but alive, the contrast becomes undeniable. Above him stands a man who should not have been the one to act, a foreigner, an outsider, someone with no claim to the covenant identity of Israel. And yet, he has demonstrated a level of righteousness, courage, and compassion that surpasses those who claim to represent God's people. What does that say about the nature of true faith? What does it reveal about where courage actually comes from? Sometimes, the ones closest to power are the furthest from truth, while those on the margins see most clearly what must be done. Ebed-Melech did not have the same reasons to stay silent, the same pressures to conform, the same fear of losing status, and because of that, he was free to act in a way others were not. But this rescue is not just a historical moment, it is a pattern, a blueprint that echoes far beyond this story. Because the 30 rags represent something deeper than their physical function. They represent the idea that even what is considered worthless can become essential in the hands of someone who understands how to use it. They represent the principle that solutions do not always come from new resources, but from reimagining what already exists. And they represent the truth that compassion often requires creativity. Ebed-Melech did not wait for perfect conditions or ideal tools. He used what was available. He adapted. He thought ahead. And in doing so, he turned discarded items into instruments of rescue. How many opportunities to help are missed because people believe they lack the right resources? How often do people wait for something better instead of using what they already have? The story also exposes a deeper contrast between two kinds of leadership. On one side there is Zedekiah, a king who holds authority but lacks the courage to use it decisively. On the other side there is Ebed-Melech, a servant who lacks formal power but exercises moral authority with clarity and conviction. One hesitates, calculates, and avoids risk. The other acts, plans, and accepts the cost. And in the end, it is the actions of the servant that preserve life, while the inaction of the king contributes to destruction. This inversion challenges every assumption about where influence truly lies, because influence is not defined by position, it is defined by action. And in this moment, the most influential person in Jerusalem is not the one on the throne, but the one at the edge of the pit. As the rescue concludes, Jeremiah is no longer in immediate danger, but the larger story is far from resolved. The city is still under siege. The decisions that led to his imprisonment still stand. The officials who wanted him dead are still in power. And the message he carries, the warning of coming judgment, has not changed. If anything, it has been reinforced. Because a city that would bury its own prophet has already revealed its trajectory. The question now is not whether Jeremiah will speak again. He will. The question is whether anyone will listen. Because rescue can restore a voice, but it cannot force an audience to hear it. And so the tension shifts. From the pit to the city, from the act of rescue to the consequences that still loom ahead. Because while one man has been pulled out of the mire, an entire nation is still sinking. And the same forces that tried to silence Jeremiah have not disappeared. They are still at work, still influencing decisions, still shaping the future. The difference now is that their failure has been exposed. They tried to eliminate the truth, and they failed. They tried to bury the voice, and it has risen again, and that changes everything. Because once truth resurfaces, it cannot be ignored in the same way. It demands a response. It forces a choice. And for Jerusalem, that choice is coming closer with every passing moment. What began as a quiet act of courage has now become a turning point. Not because it stops what is coming, but because it ensures that what is coming will be understood. The rescue of Jeremiah is not the end of the crisis, it is the confirmation of it. And as the city continues to move toward its inevitable confrontation with Babylon, one question remains, echoing through every street, every decision, every moment of hesitation. What happens when a people are given every chance to listen and still refuse to change? Jerusalem did not fall in a single moment. It collapsed slowly, like a structure already weakened from within, waiting only for pressure from the outside to expose what had long been broken on the inside. The rescue of Jeremiah had preserved the voice of truth, but it had not changed the hearts of those who refused to listen. And that is the tension that now tightens around the city. What happens when truth is heard, but still rejected? The answer was already forming beyond the walls, where the armies of Babylon remained relentless, patient, unmoved by the internal struggles of a kingdom that had already chosen its path. Because external judgment often arrives only after internal resistance has hardened beyond repair. Inside the city, the signs were unmistakable. Hunger deepened. Morale collapsed. Fear became the unspoken language of every street and household. And yet, even in this state, the leadership continued to hesitate, to delay, to search for alternatives that no longer existed. Zedekiah still sat on the throne, but his authority had become hollow, his decisions reactive rather than decisive, his leadership defined more by what he avoided than by what he chose. He had been given opportunities, clear moments where he could have aligned himself with truth, where he could have acted with courage, where he could have led his people toward the only path that might have preserved life. But each time, fear had won. Each time the opinions of others had outweighed conviction. Each time silence had replaced action. What is the cost of a leader who knows the truth but refuses to stand on it? That question now begins to answer itself in the unraveling of everything he was meant to protect. Jeremiah continued to speak, his voice no longer buried in the pit, but no less urgent, no less unwelcome. His message had not changed because the situation had not changed. Surrender was still the only way. Resistance would still lead to destruction. The choice remained the same, but the window to act was closing rapidly, and still, the king wavered. There is something profoundly dangerous about delayed obedience, about recognizing the right path but postponing the decision to take it. Because time does not pause while we hesitate. Consequences do not wait for clarity. And in Jerusalem, every moment of indecision was bringing them closer to a point where no decision would matter anymore. Then it happened. The breach. The walls that had once symbolized strength, protection, and divine favor were finally broken. Not in a dramatic instant that inspired heroic resistance, but in a way that reflected the reality of the city's condition: inevitable, overwhelming, final. The Babylonian forces entered, not as a surprise, but as the fulfillment of everything Jeremiah had warned about. What kind of ending awaits a people who ignore every warning given to them? The answer unfolded in fire, in chaos, in the collapse of everything they believed could not fall. The temple, the center of their identity, their worship, their sense of divine security, was not spared. It burned, and with it, the illusion that they were untouchable was reduced to ash. Panic spread through the city. The same leaders who had confidently silenced the prophet now faced the reality they had tried to avoid. There was no strategy left. No negotiation that could undo what had been set in motion. And in the midst of this chaos, Zedekiah made one final decision that would define his legacy, not as a king who stood firm in crisis, but as one who ran from it. Under the cover of night, he fled. Not toward confrontation, not toward surrender, but toward escape. It was the final act of a pattern that had defined his leadership from the beginning. When faced with truth, he hesitated. When faced with pressure, he yielded, and when faced with consequences, he ran. But escape was an illusion. The Babylonian army pursued him, caught him, and brought him before their king. And in that moment, the weight of every decision he had avoided, every truth he had ignored, every opportunity he had missed came crashing down in a way that could not be undone. He was forced to watch the execution of his own sons, his future, his legacy before his eyes were put out, leaving him in darkness for the rest of his life. It is a brutal image, but it carries a deeper meaning. A man who refused to see the truth while he had the ability to act was left unable to see anything at all. What begins as spiritual blindness often ends in consequences that cannot be reversed. The contrast could not be sharper. On one side, a king with power, status, and authority loses everything because he refused to act when it mattered most. On the other side, a foreign official with none of those advantages had already changed the course of a life through a single act of courage. The structures of power that once seemed unshakable were now collapsing, while the impact of one man's decision continued to stand. This is the reversal that history often reveals. It is not always the powerful who shape the outcome, but the ones who act with conviction when others remain still. As Jerusalem burned, as its people were taken into exile, as its identity was dismantled piece by piece, the story of Ebed-Melech began to stand out with increasing clarity. Because while the city fell, he did not. While leaders were judged, he was remembered. And while the system that had condemned Jeremiah collapsed, the act that had saved him remained. What determines who stands when everything else falls? It is not position, it is not status, it is not proximity to power. It is the choices made when it would have been easier to do nothing. There is something deeply unsettling about this moment, because it forces a reflection that goes beyond the story itself. Jerusalem did not lack information, it did not lack warning, it did not lack opportunity. What it lacked was the willingness to respond, and that is a condition that can exist in any time, in any place, in any system. Because the distance between knowing and doing is where most failures occur. People convince themselves that awareness is enough, that understanding replaces action, that agreement with truth somehow counts as obedience to it. But the fall of Jerusalem reveals the reality. Truth that is not acted upon does not protect, it condemns. And yet, even in this destruction, there is a thread of something else, something that does not collapse with the city. Because while judgment is falling on the kingdom, a different outcome is being prepared for the one who chose courage over silence. While Zedekiah's story ends in darkness, another story is about to reveal what happens when someone trusts in God enough to act, even when everything around them suggests they should remain still. Because the fall of a kingdom is not the end of every story within it. Sometimes, it is the moment where a different kind of reward begins to emerge. As the smoke rises from the ruins of Jerusalem, as the echoes of destruction replace the sounds of daily life, one question remains, lingering in the aftermath of everything that has happened. When everything you trusted collapses, what determines whether you fall with it, or stand apart from it? The answer is not found in what you had, but in what you chose to do when it mattered most. And for one man, that choice is about to be answered in a way no one in Jerusalem could have predicted. The fire had done its work. Jerusalem was no longer a city, it was a memory wrapped in smoke, a silence broken only by the sounds of ruin and exile. The walls that once defined its strength were shattered, the temple that once symbolized its identity reduced to ash, and the people who once believed they were untouchable were now scattered under the shadow of Babylon. Everything that could fall had fallen. And in the aftermath of such total collapse, a deeper question begins to rise from the ashes. When judgment comes, what determines who is preserved and who is lost? Because not everyone shared the same fate. In the middle of destruction, in the chaos of conquest and the unraveling of a nation, there was a quiet, almost hidden moment where God spoke not to a king, not to a general, not to a priest, but to a foreigner. To Ebed-Melech, the man who had stepped forward when no one else would, the man who had risked everything to rescue Jeremiah from the pit. And what makes this moment so powerful is not just the message itself, but the timing of it. Because this promise does not come in a moment of peace, or victory, or stability. It comes at the edge of disaster, when everything around him is collapsing, when the consequences of a nation's disobedience are fully unfolding. What does it mean to receive a promise from God? When the world around you is falling apart, the word comes through Jeremiah, the very man Ebed-Melech had saved, creating a connection that is impossible to ignore. The one he rescued now becomes the one who delivers his reward. But this is not a reward in the way the world typically understands it. There is no promotion, no elevation to power, no escape from the reality of what is happening to Jerusalem. Instead, the promise is both simple and profound. His life will be spared. He will not fall by the sword. He will not be swept away in the destruction that consumes the city. His life will be given to him as a prize of war. At first glance it may seem small compared to the scale of what is happening. But in a moment where death surrounds him, where entire families are being destroyed, where leaders are being judged and nations are being dismantled, the preservation of life is not small, it is everything. And then comes the reason. because you have trusted in me, not because of his position, not because of his background, not because of any claim to belonging within the covenant identity of Israel, but because of trust. This is the defining factor, the line that separates his outcome from the fate of those around him. And it reveals something that cuts through every assumption about who qualifies for God's protection and favor. Ebed-Melech was not an Israelite. He was not raised within the traditions, the laws, the identity of the chosen people. He stood outside all of that. And yet, when the moment came, he acted in a way that aligned him more closely with God's heart than those who had every advantage of knowledge and heritage. What does it say when an outsider demonstrates more faith than those who are supposed to embody it? It forces a shift in perspective, because faith is not proven by association, it is proven by action. It is not defined by what someone claims to believe, but by what they are willing to risk when belief is tested. Ebed-Melech did not just agree with what was right, he acted on it. He did not just recognize injustice, he confronted it. He did not just feel compassion, he translated it into movement, into strategy, into a tangible act that preserved life. And in doing so, he revealed a truth that echoes far beyond this moment. God responds not to empty alignment, but to active trust. There is also something deeply intentional about the nature of the promise itself. His life will be given to him as a prize. That language carries weight, because it reframes survival not as luck, not as coincidence, but as something granted, something purposeful. In the middle of chaos, his preservation becomes a testimony. While others fall, his survival tells a story. It speaks of a different kind of security, one that is not tied to walls, or armies, or political systems, but to something far more stable: trust in God. What happens when everything you thought would protect you fails? That question had already been answered in the fall of Jerusalem, but now another answer begins to emerge: what remains when everything else is stripped away? Ebed-Melech's story stands as a quiet contradiction to everything that just happened. The king had power, yet lost everything. The officials had influence, yet could not prevent destruction. The people had identity, yet were carried into exile. And yet a man who had none of those things, no power, no influence, no claim to the covenant identity, was preserved, not because he was stronger, not because he was smarter, but because he trusted God enough to act when it mattered most. This is where the story moves beyond history and becomes something personal, something confronting, because it raises a question that cannot be ignored. When the moment comes, what will determine your response? There is a tendency to believe that courage requires perfect conditions, that faith becomes visible only when the outcome is certain, that action is justified only when the risk is manageable. But Ebed-Melech's story dismantles all of that. He acted when the risk was real, when the outcome was uncertain, when the cost was high. And that is precisely why his action mattered. Because true faith is not revealed in safety, it is revealed in decision. It is revealed in the moment where doing nothing would be easier, safer, more acceptable. It is revealed when someone chooses to step forward, not because they are guaranteed success, but because they are unwilling to accept silence. And this is where the story turns outward, beyond the walls of Jerusalem, beyond the specifics of this ancient moment, into something that continues to resonate. Because the cistern is not just a physical place in the story, it becomes a symbol of situations where truth is being buried, where injustice is being ignored, where voices are being silenced. And the question that emerges is not just about what Ebed-Melech did, but about what others will do when they encounter their own version of that moment. Where are the pits today? Where are the places where something or someone is being left to sink while others choose to look away? And more importantly, who is willing to step forward? Because the tools may not look the same, but the principle remains. Ebed-Melech used what he had: 30 men, old rags, a willingness to act. He did not wait for a perfect plan or ideal resources. He used what was available and turned it into something that made a difference. And that challenges the assumption that impact requires abundance. Sometimes it requires awareness. Sometimes it requires creativity, but most of all, it requires the decision to move. What could happen if more people chose action over hesitation, conviction over comfort, courage over silence? As the story settles into its final moments, the contrast remains clear. A kingdom falls because it refuses to listen. A king loses everything because he refuses to act, but an outsider is preserved because he chooses to trust. And that contrast does not fade with time, it sharpens. It becomes a lens through which every similar moment can be viewed, because the dynamics have not changed. Power still resists truth, systems still protect themselves, people still hesitate, and yet, the opportunity for courage still exists. The promise given to Ebed-Melech is not just a conclusion, it is an invitation to understand what truly matters when everything else is stripped away. Because in the end, the question is not whether moments of decision will come. They will. The question is what will define the response when they do. Will it be fear like Zedekiah? Will it be silence like the officials? Or will it be courage, like a man who had every reason to stay quiet, but chose to act? Because sometimes, the ones who change everything are not the ones expected to lead. They are the ones willing to move, when no one else will. The story should have ended in ashes, a city destroyed, a king blinded and broken, a people scattered into exile under the crushing weight of Babylon. By every visible measure, this was not a story of victory, it was a story of collapse, of consequences, of a nation that ignored every warning until there was nothing left to save. And yet, somehow, this is not how the story is remembered, because history does not only preserve what falls, it preserves what stands in the middle of the fall. And in this case, what stands is not a throne, not a temple, not a system of power. It is a decision, a single moment where one man chose courage over silence. Why is it that in the ruins of an entire kingdom, one act of mercy continues to echo louder than the destruction itself? Because courage leaves a mark that collapse cannot erase. The name Ebed-Melech does not appear often. He is not a central figure in the broader narrative. He does not lead armies, he does not write scripture, he does not shape policy or command influence. And yet, his presence interrupts the trajectory of death with something unexpected intervention. He steps into a moment that everyone else had accepted, challenges a decision that had already been justified, and changes an outcome that seemed inevitable. What kind of person does that? Not someone driven by recognition, because there was none to gain. Not someone guaranteed protection, because the risk was real. It is the kind of person who sees something wrong and refuses to let it remain that way, even if standing up means standing alone. And that is what makes his story endure, because it exposes something uncomfortable. Most people in Jerusalem knew what was happening to Jeremiah. The pit was not a secret, the injustice was not hidden. The decision had been made publicly, with the approval, however passive, of the king himself. And yet, knowledge did not produce action. Awareness did not create movement. The majority saw, and did nothing. How often does that pattern repeat itself? Not in ancient cities, but in everyday life, in systems, in environments where something is clearly wrong, clearly harmful, clearly unjust, and yet continues because it is easier to remain still than to step forward. The difference between Ebed-Melech and everyone else was not access to information. It was the willingness to respond to it. And that difference is everything. Because history is shaped less by what people know, and more by what they do with what they know. Jerusalem knew the truth and rejected it. Zedekiah knew the truth and avoided it. The officials knew the truth and suppressed it. But Ebed-Melech encountered the truth and acted on it. That is the dividing line that runs through this entire story, not between nations, not between insiders and outsiders, but between action and inaction. And once that line is drawn, the outcomes begin to separate. The ones who resist truth eventually face its consequences. The ones who align with it, even imperfectly, even at great cost, find themselves preserved in ways that go beyond the moment itself. There is also something deeply strategic about his courage. It was not reckless, it was not impulsive. He did not storm into the situation driven by emotion alone. He approached the king, he made a case, he secured permission, he gathered resources, he involved others, he used wisdom alongside boldness. And that combination matters, because it shows that courage is not just about standing up, it is about knowing how to act in a way that actually changes something. Too often, people separate conviction from strategy, as if one must exist without the other. But Ebed-Melech demonstrates that effective courage requires both. It requires the willingness to confront and the wisdom to execute. And then there are the rags, 30 simple, worn-out pieces of cloth, useless by most standards, discarded, overlooked, forgotten. And yet, in the hands of someone willing to act, they became the difference between life and death. This detail is easy to miss, but it carries a powerful implication, because it challenges the idea that impact requires something extraordinary. Sometimes it requires using what is already available in a way no one else considered. The ropes could have pulled Jeremiah out, but they would have torn his weakened body. The rags transformed a rescue from force into compassion. What does that say about the kind of courage that truly changes things? It is not just bold, it is thoughtful. It is not just decisive, it is empathetic. It does not just solve the problem, it considers the cost of the solution. And that kind of courage leaves a different kind of legacy, because long after the city falls, long after the political structures disappear, long after the consequences of disobedience play out, what remains is the story of someone who refused to let another person sink into silence. And that story continues to speak, not because it is grand, but because it is real. It reflects the kind of moments that still exist, moments where something is wrong, where someone is being overlooked, where a voice is being ignored, where the outcome seems inevitable. And in those moments, the same question emerges: who will act? It is easy to assume that someone else will step in, someone with more authority, more influence, more responsibility. But that assumption is exactly what keeps most situations unchanged. Everyone waits for someone else, and in that waiting, nothing happens. Ebed-Melech disrupts that pattern. He does not wait. He does not defer. He does not assume that action belongs to someone else. He sees the situation as his responsibility the moment he recognizes it. And that shift from observation to ownership is what transforms him from a bystander into a catalyst. What if more people made that shift? What if the moments that are often ignored became the moments that defined action? What if the limitations people use as excuses, lack of status, lack of resources, lack of recognition, were no longer seen as barriers, but as irrelevant in the face of what is right? Because that is what this story ultimately reveals. The conditions do not need to be ideal for courage to exist. In fact, courage often appears precisely because the conditions are not ideal. It emerges in tension, in risk, in uncertainty. It is not comfortable. It is not convenient, but it is necessary. And its impact is not always immediate or visible. Jerusalem still fell. The rescue of Jeremiah did not stop the invasion. It did not reverse the consequences of years of disobedience. And that raises another important truth: courage does not always change the outcome of the larger situation. Sometimes, the system still collapses. Sometimes, the consequences still unfold. But that does not mean the act was insignificant. Because while the larger structure may fall, individual outcomes can still be transformed. Jeremiah lived, Ebed-Melech was preserved, and their stories became part of something that extended far beyond that moment. This is where the meaning deepens, because it reframes success. Success is not always preventing collapse. Sometimes it is remaining faithful within it. Sometimes it is preserving what can be preserved, even when everything else is being lost. Sometimes it is ensuring that in the middle of destruction there is still evidence that courage existed, that truth was not completely silenced, that someone was willing to stand, and that evidence matters. Because it becomes a reference point for every future moment that looks similar. It becomes proof that action is possible, that silence is not the only option, that even in the darkest situations, someone can choose differently. And once that possibility is established, it cannot be undone. The story continues to exist, continuing to confront, to challenge, to ask the same question again and again in different forms, in different contexts, in different lives. Where is the pit now? Where is the place where something is being allowed to sink because it is easier to ignore than to address? Where is the situation where action feels risky, where speaking up feels costly, where stepping forward feels uncertain? Because those are the moments where this story becomes more than history. Those are the moments where it becomes a decision. And decisions create legacy, not the kind written in monuments or recorded in power structures, but the kind that lives in impact, in outcomes, in the difference made in a moment that could have gone another way. Ebed-Melech did not set out to create a legacy. He simply refused to accept silence, and in doing so he became part of a story that continues to speak long after the city he lived in disappeared. Because in the end, what defines a life is not how much control it had, but how it responded when control was limited. Jerusalem had control and lost everything. A king had authority and used it to avoid responsibility, but a servant had a moment and used it to act. And that is why, even now, when the ruins have long faded and the details of the destruction have become distant, one truth remains clear: courage, when it is chosen at the right moment, outlives everything that tries to bury it. Long after the smoke cleared, long after the walls of Jerusalem had been reduced to ruins and its people carried into exile by Babylon, the deeper weight of the story did not disappear, it intensified. Because once the noise of destruction fades, what remains is not just what happened, but what it means. And this is where the story refuses to stay in the past. It begins to press forward, confronting every generation with the same unsettling question: what will you do when you are placed in a moment that demands courage? Because moments like that are not rare. They don't always look dramatic. They don't always come with warning. Sometimes they appear quietly, almost unnoticed at first: a situation that feels wrong, a voice that is being ignored, a decision that seems unjust. And in that moment something internal begins to shift. A tension forms between what is easy and what is right. Most people feel it. Most people recognize it. But not everyone responds to it. Why is that? Why do so many see what needs to be done and still choose to do nothing? Because courage is costly. It disrupts comfort. It challenges systems. It invites risk. And perhaps most difficult of all, it removes the ability to remain neutral. Once you see clearly, once you understand what is happening, choosing not to act is no longer passive, it becomes a decision in itself. That is the pressure of clarity. And that is the space where most people hesitate. They begin to weigh the consequences, to calculate the risks, to consider what might be lost. And in that calculation, something subtle happens. They begin to look for reasons not to act. That is exactly what Zedekiah did. He had clarity. He had access to Jeremiah. He knew the truth. But every time he approached the moment where action was required, he stepped back. Not because he didn't understand, but because he feared the cost of responding. And that pattern did not just define his leadership, it defined his outcome. Because the refusal to act when it matters most does not preserve safety, it delays consequence. And when consequence finally arrives, it arrives without the possibility of reversal. That is the warning embedded in this story. But there is also another path, another pattern, another response that exists alongside it, and it is seen in Ebed-Melech, because when he encountered his moment, he did not wait for certainty. He did not search for approval beyond what was necessary. He did not allow the fear of consequence to outweigh the urgency of action. He moved, and in that movement, something shifted, not just for Jeremiah, but for himself. Because every act of courage does two things at once. It changes a situation, and it shapes the person who chooses it. That is why courage is never just about the external outcome. It is also about internal alignment. It is about becoming the kind of person who responds to truth with action, who refuses to allow fear to dictate decisions, who recognizes that moments of responsibility are not interruptions, they are defining points. And once that pattern is established, it does not stay confined to a single event. It begins to influence every future decision, every future moment where the same tension appears again. Because it will appear again, that is, the reality this story brings into focus. The cistern is not a one-time event in history, it is a recurring condition. Different context, different form, same principle. Somewhere something is being pushed down, ignored, silenced, or left unresolved. Somewhere a voice is being dismissed because it is inconvenient. Somewhere a situation continues because no one is willing to step forward and disrupt it. And in each of those moments, the same opportunity exists, the opportunity to act. But opportunity does not guarantee action. That is where the separation happens. Some will recognize the moment and move. Others will recognize it and remain still. And that difference, though it may seem small in the moment, creates outcomes that are vastly different over time. Because action accumulates, it builds, it compounds, and eventually it defines a life. What kind of life is built on hesitation? What kind of life is built on courage? These are not abstract questions. They are practical, immediate, unavoidable, because every decision contributes to the answer. Every moment of tension adds another layer, and over time, a pattern emerges, either one of avoidance or one of action, either one of silence or one of response. And the truth is, most people do not intend to live in silence. They do not wake up deciding to ignore what is right. They do not consciously choose inaction as a defining trait. It happens gradually. It happens through small compromises, through moments where action feels unnecessary, through decisions to wait, to delay, to let someone else handle it. And over time, those small decisions create a pattern that becomes harder to break, because the longer someone remains still, the more natural stillness begins to feel. That is why moments of courage are so critical. They interrupt that pattern. They break the cycle of hesitation. They introduce a different way of responding. And once that interruption happens, it creates a new possibility, a possibility that did not exist before. The possibility that action is not only necessary, but achievable. The possibility that risk can be taken and survived. The possibility that one decision can shift the direction of something that seemed fixed. Ebed-Melech did not change the entire system, but he changed something within it. And that matters, because not every moment of courage is meant to transform everything. Sometimes, it is meant to transform something specific, something targeted, something immediate. And in doing so, it creates a ripple effect that extends beyond what can be seen at the time. Jeremiah lived, a message continued, a promise was delivered, and a story was formed, one that would continue to challenge and inspire long after the original moment had passed. That is the power of a single decision. And that is why this story does not end with destruction. It ends with a call that does not come as a command, but as a question. Where is your moment? Where is the place where you are being invited to act? Not in theory, not in imagination, but in reality, in something tangible, something present. Because the relevance of this story is not measured by how well it is understood, but by how it is applied. An application requires movement. It requires stepping out of observation and into participation. It requires accepting that the moment is not someone else's responsibility. It requires recognizing that waiting for ideal conditions is often another form of avoidance, because the truth is, the moment will never feel completely safe. There will always be uncertainty. There will always be risk. There will always be something that makes hesitation seem reasonable. But there will also always be something that makes action necessary. And the decision between those two realities is where courage is formed. So the story moves forward, not as a closed account of what once happened, but as an open challenge that continues to unfold, because somewhere, even now, the same dynamics are at play. The same tensions exist, the same opportunities are present, and the same question is waiting to be answered, not in words, but in action. Will you remain where it is comfortable, or will you step into the moment that requires courage? Because in the end, it is not the size of the moment that defines its impact. It is the willingness to act within it. There is always a moment, not a loud one, not always dramatic. Often it arrives quietly, almost unnoticed at first, hidden inside an ordinary situation that suddenly doesn't feel ordinary anymore. A moment where something is clearly wrong. A moment where silence feels heavier than speech. A moment where doing nothing begins to feel like a decision in itself. And in that space, small, tense, unavoidable, something begins to form. A choice. Not theoretical, not distant, but immediate and personal. Because in that moment, the story of Ebed-Melech stops being history and starts becoming a mirror. Because the truth is, everyone reaches that moment eventually. The details change. The setting shifts. The stakes may look different on the surface, but the core remains the same. There is something at risk, there is something at stake, and there is an opportunity to act or to remain still. Most people think their defining moments will come with clarity, with certainty, with a sense that this is the moment that will shape everything. But that is rarely how it happens. More often, defining moments feel uncertain, inconvenient, even uncomfortable. They do not announce themselves. They demand to be recognized, and recognition is where everything begins. Because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. Once you understand, you cannot pretend ignorance. That is the weight of awareness. It creates responsibility, and responsibility leads to tension, the tension between what is easy and what is necessary. That tension is what Zedekiah felt again and again, and each time he resolved it the same way, by choosing what felt safer in the moment, by delaying, by avoiding, by allowing others to decide. And each time he made that choice, it felt small, almost insignificant. But those small decisions accumulated, forming a pattern that eventually led to a collapse he could no longer escape. That is the danger of hesitation. It rarely feels dangerous in the moment. It feels reasonable. It feels cautious. It feels like giving yourself more time. But time does not remove responsibility, it intensifies it. Because while you hesitate, the situation continues to develop. The consequences move forward. The opportunity to act begins to narrow, and eventually the moment passes, not because it was resolved, but because it was missed. How many moments are lost that way? Not because people didn't care, but because they waited. Waited for clarity, waited for support, waited for a sign that it was the right time. But the reality is, the right time is rarely comfortable. It is rarely convenient. It often feels premature, uncertain, even risky. And that is why so many people miss it, because they are looking for a version of the moment that removes the need for courage. But courage is the point. Without risk, it is not courage. Without uncertainty, it is not courage. Without cost, it is not courage. That is what makes the decision meaningful, and that is what makes the story of Ebed-Melech so confronting. Because when his moment came, he did not have certainty. He did not have guarantees. He did not know how it would end. All he knew was that something was wrong, and that doing nothing was not an option he was willing to accept. That clarity did not come from perfect information. It came from conviction, and conviction moves faster than fear. Fear calculates, fear delays, fear looks for escape routes, for alternatives, for reasons to step back. Conviction does something different. It simplifies, it reduces the situation to what matters most. It cuts through the noise, the complexity, the uncertainty, and focuses on a single question: what is right? And once that question is answered, the next step becomes clear, not easy, not safe, but clear. That is the moment where decision becomes action. And action is what separates potential from impact. Because potential is everywhere. Many people have the ability to act. Many people recognize what should be done. Many people feel the tension of the moment, but impact belongs to those who move. It belongs to those who take the step, who accept the risk, who engage the situation rather than observing it. And that movement does not have to be dramatic. It does not have to be large or visible. It simply has to exist. Ebed-Melech did not change everything. He changed something. And that something mattered because it preserved a life. It preserved a voice. It preserved a message that would continue beyond that moment. And in doing so, it proved that even within a collapsing system, even within a situation that seemed beyond repair, there was still space for intervention. There was still space for difference. There was still space for someone to choose a different outcome for at least part of the story. That is where hope exists. Not in the illusion that everything can always be fixed, but in the reality that something can always be done. And that something is often closer than people think. It is in the conversation that needs to happen. It is in the decision to speak when silence would be easier. It is in the willingness to step forward when others step back. It is in the use of whatever resources are available, no matter how limited they may seem, because impact is not determined by what you have, it is determined by what you do with what you have. That is why the detail of the rags matters so much, because it removes every excuse related to limitation. It shows that action does not wait for ideal conditions. It uses what is present. It adapts, it moves. And in doing so, it transforms something that seemed insignificant into something that becomes essential. That is the shift from passivity to responsibility. And once that shift happens, it changes how every future moment is approached, because you begin to see differently. You begin to recognize that moments are not just events, they are opportunities. Opportunities to align with what is right. Opportunities to interrupt what is wrong. Opportunities to become the kind of person who acts rather than observes. And that identity, once formed, begins to influence everything. Because you no longer ask, "Is this my responsibility?" You ask, "What can I do here?" That question changes everything. It removes the distance between you and the situation. It removes the excuse of irrelevance. It replaces hesitation with engagement. And in that engagement, even small actions begin to carry weight, because they are no longer isolated. They are part of a pattern of response, a pattern of courage, a pattern that, over time, becomes a defining characteristic. And that is where the story reaches its deepest level. Because it is no longer about a single decision in a distant past. It is about a way of living, a way of responding to moments as they come, a way of recognizing that every situation holds the potential for action, and that action, repeated over time, creates something far greater than any single moment could produce. It creates a life marked by courage, not perfect, not fearless, but consistent, willing, responsive. And that kind of life does not just react to history, it shapes it, even in small ways, even in unseen ways, even in moments that never become widely known, because impact is not measured only by visibility. It is measured by difference, by what changed because someone chose to act, by what was preserved because someone refused to remain silent, by what continued because someone stepped in when it mattered. And that brings the story to its final tension. Not a question of what happened, but a question of what will happen next, because the pattern continues. Moments will come, opportunities will appear, tension will rise, and the same decision will stand in front of anyone willing to see it, to act, or to remain still. And in that decision, everything is defined, not all at once, but one moment at a time. In the end, the story does not close with a conclusion, it lingers with a question. Jerusalem is gone. Its walls are broken, its temple reduced to ash, its people carried away under the shadow of Babylon. The throne of Zedekiah is empty, his story marked not by power but by the cost of hesitation. The system that once seemed permanent has collapsed completely, leaving behind nothing but the evidence of what happens when truth is ignored and action is delayed. Everything that defined the strength of that kingdom has disappeared, and yet, not everything is lost, because in the middle of that collapse, one story remains untouched by the fire, untouched by the destruction, untouched by the failure of leadership and the consequences of a nation. The story of Ebed-Melech still stands, not because he was powerful, not because he controlled outcomes, but because when his moment came, he made a decision that aligned with something greater than fear. And that decision outlived everything else. This is what makes the ending so unsettling, because it shifts the focus away from what happened to them and places it directly on what happens to us. The ruins of Jerusalem are not just a historical outcome. They are a reflection of a pattern that continues to exist wherever truth is known but not followed, wherever action is possible but postponed, wherever responsibility is seen but avoided. And if that pattern still exists, then so does the alternative. Because Ebed-Melech's story is not an exception, it is an example of what happens when someone refuses to let a moment pass without responding to it, an example of what happens when conviction overrides fear, when clarity leads to movement, when responsibility is embraced instead of deflected. And that example does not fade with time. It remains, waiting to be repeated, waiting to be lived out again in different places, different contexts, different lives. Which leads to the final question, not what did he do, but what will you do? Because the story has already shown both paths. One path is hesitation. It is the path of Zedekiah path, where truth is acknowledged but not acted upon, where decisions are delayed, where responsibility is avoided in favor of temporary safety. It feels easier in the moment, it feels safer, but over time it leads to consequences that cannot be undone. It leads to missed opportunities, to outcomes that could have been different, to a legacy defined not by what was done, but by what was left undone. The other path is courage. It is the path of Ebed-Melech, a path where action is taken despite uncertainty, where risk is accepted in order to do what is right, where responsibility is embraced even when it would be easier to ignore it. It is not the easier path. It does not guarantee comfort, but it creates impact. It changes outcomes. It defines a life not by avoidance but by response. And the difference between those two paths is not circumstance. It is decision. That is what this entire story has been building toward. Not a lesson to observe, but a reality to confront, because every person at some point stands in a moment where that decision must be made. Not in theory, not in imagination, but in reality, where something is at stake, where the cost is real, where the outcome is not guaranteed. And in that moment, everything that has been heard, everything that has been understood, everything that has been understood, everything that has been recognized comes down to a single point. Will you act, or will you remain still? There is no neutral ground in that moment, because choosing not to act is still a choice. It still shapes the outcome. It still contributes to what happens next. That is the weight of responsibility. And that is why so many try to avoid it, because once you accept that your response matters, you can no longer pretend that it doesn't. You can no longer distance yourself from the outcome. You become part of it. But that is also where meaning is found, because a life that never engages, that never responds, that never steps into the moments that matter remains untouched, but also unchanged. It avoids risk, but it also avoids impact. It avoids failure, but it also avoids significance. And in the end, it leaves behind very little that could not have been replaced by silence. Ebed-Melech chose something different. He stepped into a moment that did not belong to him by position, but became his by recognition. He accepted the risk. He used what he had. He acted, and because of that, something changed. A life was saved. A voice continued. A promise was fulfilled. And a story was written, one that continues to challenge every person who encounters it. Because the final question is not comfortable. It does not allow distance. It does not allow observation without involvement. It presses in, quietly but persistently, asking the same thing in different ways, in different moments, in different situations. Where is your cistern? Where is the place where something is being left to sink while others look away? Where is the situation where you feel the tension between what is easy and what is right? Where is the moment where you know something should be done, but it has not been done yet? Because those are not random questions. They are invitations. Invitations to step into the story, not as a spectator, but as a participant. Invitations to move from awareness to action. Invitations to become the kind of person whose decisions create impact rather than avoid it. And the truth is, no one else can answer that for you. No one else can step into your moment. No one else can make your decision. Because in the end, the story is not about what happened long ago. It is about what happens now. It is about the next moment, the next opportunity, the next decision. And when that moment comes, as it always does, it will not announce itself as significant. It will simply present itself as a choice to act, or to remain still. And in that choice, whether small or large, visible or unseen, immediate or delayed, something is always being defined. A direction, a pattern, a life. So the story does not end with a statement. It ends with a question that continues to echo long after the words are finished. When your moment comes, which path will you choose?